Thank you very much, Dara, for that introduction, and thank you to the NCSE for having us here today, especially to present what's still very much a work in progress. We think it's a great opportunity to get your feedback, comments, suggestions, questions, either in the Q&A at the end of this, or if you want to email myself or Selina or get in contact with us in any way afterwards, that'd be very much appreciated. But I suppose the problem with presenting a work in progress is it's going to be a bit like one movie in the Marvel Cinematic Universe you're getting here today, that there's going to be a lot of pointing forward at what's to come in the pipeline. But with that being said, there's still an awful lot in today's presentation, so I might be challenging for Emer's words per minute record from this morning. So I'd like to apologise in advance to the signers, and if I'm going too quickly, please do say. And I'd like to thank as well, specifically, Caroline and Jennifer for cutting down the original 90-slide behemoth we sent them to a much more respectable 45 slides. So yeah, I'll get started now with one eye on the clock and one eye on Selina, who's going to push me off the stage, I think, in about 25 minutes, but we'll fly through it. But yeah, we'd be delighted to hear questions and comments at the end. So in terms of what we're going to be focusing on today, we'll start by outlining the research focus and the research questions guiding the study. And then we'll briefly look through the research design, the methodology that we were using. And then we'll get into the school experiences of students with SEN in mainstream schools, then the main post-school pathways for students with SEN, and again, that's focusing mainly on mainstream schools. And then Selina's going to take over then and talk about the school and post-school experiences of students in special schools, and then finish up with those next steps for the project. So in terms of the research focus and the research questions which are guiding this research, the first one is, why do young people end up on particular post-school pathways, and what factors are influencing their decisions or their pathways? And then following on from that, what are their experiences of the young people on the different pathways? So we'll touch on this today, but again, that will be more covered in the second half of the research, which has yet to take place. Then what are the views of schools, families, post-school providers regarding post-school options for young people with special educational and learning needs? And finally then, looking forward, what lessons can be identified from this research to support planning and service provision for the inclusion of disabled young people in post-school life? So just a brief overview of the research design. As you can see, we have wave one there from spring of 2022, which was the first wave of a longitudinal study among sixth-year students with special educational needs, and interviews of 10 guidance counsellors and SEN coordinators, 10 parents, and ultimately 15 young people with special educational needs. And then the second wave of that is going to be taking place between now and Christmas probably, with those young people who took part in the first wave of the survey, and then a separate survey focusing on the post-school settings where people are going to. And then this is all supplemented with a detailed secondary analysis of growing up in Ireland data using the 98 cohort, and looking at their experiences and outcomes at age 17 and 18, and then again at 20. So in terms of then the school experiences of students with SEN in mainstream schools, so these are the first kind of findings from the School Leavers survey. So the school sample, we were sampling on kind of to get a good representation of DESH schools, a good representation of schools with special classes, a good regional distribution, a good mix of school types was the main focus. So the study ended up including 421 sixth-year students, and we found a slight over-representation of students attending DESH schools. The most common disabilities or impairments identified were learning disabilities or social emotional difficulties or disabilities, and 37% of the sample indicated that they had more than one special educational need. So in terms of their reflections then on their school experiences, you can see, we might start from the positive, I suppose, and work our way down to the negative. So you can see a very strong level of encouragement by teachers to continue with education or with training after school at 72%. But then there's kind of a disconnect there, and that students felt they had the encouragement maybe, but not the information. So only 57.6% felt they had all the info they needed to continue with this education or training. Then in terms of actual experiences of school, 56% found schoolwork hard, and only 53% felt that they got all the support that they needed to learn. And then perhaps the most surprising and The most negative finding will be that only 38.4% of the survey reported liking school. So if we compare this to the GUI findings, it's a slightly different question that the GUI students were asked whether they dislike school. So maybe more likely to disagree with that than to agree that you like school. But we found that 68% of 17 or 18-year-olds with special educational needs don't dislike school or like school if you eliminate the double negative, and 78% without special educational needs. So you can see we've quite a gap there in our survey. And then within our survey, again, there was a strong DESH effect. So students in DESH schools, 69% disliked school compared to 56% of students in non-DESH school. So that's driving a lot of that disliking school effect. And in terms of what this meant for students then, students who didn't like school were less likely to have similar ideas as their teachers about what they were going to do post-school. So it is having an effect on their kind of future plans. So in terms of students' perception of what they were getting out of school and how school was helping them to develop their personal skills and as a person, we can see that there's fairly strong agreement that school helped, either a little or a lot. Like it's at about 80% or more for all of the different questions. But again, we see some differences with the GUI overall population findings here. So in our study, we had 39.5% said it helped a lot with developing as a person, and about 80% said it helped a little or helped a lot, whereas in GUI, it's over 90%, and it is 45% said it helped a lot. So there's a bit of a difference there. Perhaps more worryingly, in terms of helping me to make new friends, we see 70% in the GUI sample said it helped a lot, compared to only 44% in our sample. So there's a big difference there, obviously. And in terms of ability to talk to others and communicate, 37% in our sample said school helped a lot, compared to 66% in GUI. So I think the finding of this slide is that generally students are quite happy with school, but that there is quite a difference between our sample and the overall population in terms of what they're getting out of school and how well they feel it's kind of preparing them as a person. So moving on then to their perception of the development of self-determination skills, so the really crucial skills to drive their own learning and their own independent life as an adult. Again, it's quite positive, I think, on the whole. 69% felt that school gave them an interest in learning. 84% felt they knew how to learn new skills. 65% felt that school helped to decide what to do after school. And 65% felt that school increased self-confidence. But then you can see in terms of school preparing them for living independently, it was quite a bit lower at 39%. So we might come back to that in the qualitative material later on. In terms of then the specific supports that students were receiving, focusing on the extra subject supports, we can see that generally they were felt to be quite helpful and doing a lot for students, but that the individual one-to-one tuition really stands out, as 97% of students receiving it found it very helpful. Then 90% agreed that the small group outside of class tuition was very helpful, and then it drops off a bit to 77% for peer mentoring, 67% for large group tuition, and then 64% for other types of subject supports. So looking into it then, we had an open question for students on extra supports that they would like to receive or would have liked to receive. And we kind of split these. So in terms of academic, people were asking for more learning support, specifically for one-to-one support, for more resource hours, for more small group instruction, and for more kind of specific subject support. But people were also asking for a lot of non-academic supports in terms of greater access to mental health supports, assistance with kind of developing their organizational skills, for social support in terms of going back to that finding about school preparing students to make new friends from the previous slide, and then kind of general therapeutic supports. So this would be not mental health therapy, but more kind of therapeutical supports for people specific physical and sensory disabilities generally. And then guidance came up a good bit. People wanted wider guidance and wanted more information on post-school options. So again, there was a lot who felt that their school was excessively focused on higher education to the detriment of other pathways, or that the school wasn't really giving them any guidance on higher education and was kind of funneling them towards further education and training or apprenticeships or other non-higher education pathways. Beyond that then, there were requests for specific accommodations and supports in terms of assistive technology, access to RACE, so the exam exemptions, access to a safe room or a space, an Irish exemption or an SNA. And then the access findings were maybe particularly interesting, and unfortunately we don't have time to go into any of the quotes here today, but again, signposting forward, the report will have them all, and they're quite powerful in terms of students being denied help that they were asking for, and then quite nuanced as well, in that the more assessment, there were some students who felt that more assessment would be useful in determining where exactly their needs lay and where the support might be helpful, and others who felt, more assessment would be just more time wasted not getting supports and instead getting access to the supports. And particularly the DARE program and the RACE scheme, getting access to those came up as a particular issue for lots of students. And then kind of beyond supports, in terms of more systemic changes, young people mentioned wanting more encouragement so that the focus would be on the positives and their kind of potential instead of their impairments or limitations that they were seen to have, and kind of linked to that there would be more motivation of them, that there would be a greater recognition of their needs, that there would be more communication, especially that communication would be a two-way street between the school and the student, rather than the school making decisions and communicating them at the student. There were some who mentioned that the supports they were receiving made them feel kind of segregated, and specifically one or two mentioned that an SNA kind of got in the way of their ability to interact with their classmates as they wanted to. And then finally, just students who felt that they weren't really treated in a way that respected them or that kind of preserved or encouraged their dignity. So looking forward then for their expectations for the future and for the expectations of important people in their life, you can see a general high level of optimism for the future, in that 85.1% agreed that they think they'll enjoy what they're doing next year more than they'll enjoy school. So mostly young people were looking forward to the future that was ahead of them. Interestingly, this wasn't particularly linked to being prepared for life after school, in that less than half of students felt that they were prepared for life after school, but this didn't hold them back from feeling that it would be better than school, which I think is an interesting finding in itself. Then in terms of people's parents, there was about 55% felt that themselves and their parents kind of had similar ideas about what they would do after school, and only 31% felt that they themselves and their teachers had similar ideas about what they'd do after school. And what was particularly interesting about the parental agreement is there was a pronounced gender difference in the agreement with parents, with 60% of boys agreeing that their parents and themselves had the same ideas of what they do after school, compared to 51% of girls. And then there was a link between people's agreement with their teachers and themselves having the same ideas about what they do after school, and general kind of positive feelings about school preparing them well. And there's another question that we couldn't include on this slide around students feeling that other people their age have similar plans and opportunities to them. And again, feeling that school prepared them well was strongly linked with a positive sentiment on that one. So, yeah, probably the nicest part of this study so far has been reading the excitement findings and hearing what these 60-year students were looking forward to when they were looking to their post-school lives. And again, I think it's pretty important to emphasize that this will be what you'd expect from any general sample of the population as well, which is good to see. So students were looking forward to growing up, to being more independent, to having money, to maturing. There were a lot of students who felt that what they were doing next would be a big improvement from school. Particularly, they were looking forward to shorter days, to less intensity, I think specifically linked to the Leaving Cert, to a better learning environment, and to the novelty of just something different from school. And then there were some students who were just delighted to be out of school as well. People were looking forward to new contacts, specifically to the university they were hoping to go to the PLC they were going to attend, to the apprenticeship, to their job, or else there were a lot that were looking forward to being able to do a specific subject in university or PLC or in the apprenticeship. And finally, I think as expected, the social life was a big part of it, with students looking forward to making new friends, some students looking forward to have a fresh start, and to having more time to engage in hobbies. On the negative side of this then, in terms of what students were worried about, I think again, unsurprisingly, given the current climate, there were a lot of worries about financial matters, both immediate in terms of being able to afford to go on to post-school opportunities, and especially for those who were thinking of living away from home, and then in the longer term around securing an education and employment that would give them a good quality of life. With regard to their particular course or setting, there was worry about getting into the course, about choosing the right course, about managing the course once they were in it. There were a few who were already looking back to a future in which they might regret the decision they were making now, which I think is an interesting way of thinking about it. And then kind of very specific concerns about setting our course, as well as the excitement about growing up. There was some worry about growing up, about being responsible for their own self-direction, about dealing with change, about leaving home, about having to start from scratch with friends and education, about dealing with the uncertainty, looking forward to homesickness, worry about future job choice, the loss of school supports, that people weren't sure they'd have continuity in the supports that they were accessing, and the greater responsibility and stress that maybe come with adult life, and that they themselves might not be mature enough to navigate all of this. In social life, again, we see that as well as being excited about it, young people were worried about it. Sometimes the same young person, the same response in making friends and in having the kind of confidence to put themselves out there. And then finally, specific access to supports, both in terms of disability supports and also mental health supports, was a significant worry. So looking then at the main post-school pathways for students with SEN, and starting with the findings from Growing Up in Ireland. So this is from wave 4 of the 20-year-olds, which is from about 2019, I think the data was collected, but it should be broadly similar now. So at age 20, 61% of young people in the sample were currently in or had completed a higher education degree, but we see very wide differences by type of SEN or disability. So 66% of young people without a special educational need, 62% identified as having physical or sensory disabilities, 49% with specific learning difficulties, 46% of those in the other disability category, and then down to 40% with social emotional SEN and 28% with intellectual disabilities. So we see really strong gaps here. And again, we're back to the Marvel Cinematic Universe, but the paper that we wrote on this, when we controlled for kind of socioeconomic and personal experiences, what we found was that the differences weren't significant except for the social emotional special educational needs. So they're the group where their background or their prior academic achievement doesn't account for that difference, that gap in higher education attendance. So looking at some of the things that do account for these gaps, we can see a mixture of kind of people's backgrounds and then people's prior academic experiences. So the biggest gap is between those who achieved 9 or more junior certificate honours and those who achieved less than 9. I think it's 85% with 9 or more junior cert honours are going on to third level, compared to less than 50% without 9 honours. So that's a real barrier there to progression. Students identified as having academic difficulty at 9, much less likely, but also looking at family and social characteristics, that students where the parents expected them to get a third level degree were much more likely, students attending a DESH school much less likely, and students whose parents, at least one, had a third level degree, much more likely. Economic vulnerability, again, unsurprisingly, associated with a lower rate of progression. But then kind of protective factors like positive school engagement at 13 linked with a higher rate. And you can see there's not much of a gender difference for this one down at the bottom there. So if we look then, because I think what's really important to emphasize is the intersectional nature of the disadvantage some students are facing. So if we look at students in the GUI sample who are identified as having a special educational need or disability, you can see that they're more likely to be in those at-risk groups from the last slide. So they're more likely to be attending a DESH school, they're more likely to have attended or experienced economic vulnerability, they're more likely to be identified as having academic issues at 9, they're less likely to be positively engaged with school and more likely to be negatively engaged with school. So that was the question at 13 around whether they liked school. So they're less likely to like school at 13. They're less likely to be expected to go on to get a degree, and they're more likely to have missed more than 10 days at 9. And so this kind of manifests itself and is also influenced by lower scores in the Drumcondra test at 13, and then ultimately fewer than 9 honours at junior certificate. So going on then to the most complicated slide of the day, and I'm sorry Jennifer, I had to include it, she didn't want it. But this one, it looks very complicated, but what we're really looking at here is just the difference in pathways. So even when students do progress onto higher education, you can see significant gaps along those mainly social and personal characteristics, and along whether they have an SEN or not. And you can see that the biggest difference is that those from the more advantaged groups socioeconomically are going on to university third level, and those from the less advantaged groups are disproportionately going on to further education and training, or not going on to any post-school education or training. And that this is significant for those who are economically vulnerable at any point, those who attended DESH schools, and for those who had an SEN at 9. So in terms of our sample then, looking at the students in the survey and what they were planning to do, you can see that where 92% of GUI students were planning to continue education, only 82% of our sample were planning. And that continue education included university, ITs, further education, PLCs, apprenticeship, and the National Learning Network and things like that. So any sort of post-school education was covered by that. And that most of this difference was made up in students expecting to go on and get a job straight from school. So much, much higher rate of 12.4% compared to 2.5% for GUI. And an interesting finding as well was that of our sample, 40% were finding it difficult to decide what to do after school compared to just 10% in GUI. So there was much more struggle and debate over what they would do. So looking then at what students were doing in terms of CAO applications, but also DARE and HERE applications, you can see that most students are applying to the CAO, but there was a big gender difference in the CAO applications, with 84% of girls applying versus only 73% of boys. And again, that kind of socioeconomic background difference, with 83% of those whose parents had a degree applying compared to 72% where the parents didn't have a degree. And then looking at DESH, you can see less than half of the sample are applying. But I think what was most interesting about with the DARE, what was most interesting was that there was a real strong DESH differential there, with 57% of those in non-DESH schools applying compared to just 13% in DESH schools. And again, the socioeconomic background, with 44% of those whose parents had a degree were applying compared to 32% whose parents didn't have a degree. And you can see we have 101 in the sample applying for the HERE, which is the higher education access route, which would be specifically for students from socioeconomically disadvantaged backgrounds. Perfect. So we'll really fly through now the interviews with the young people. So first of all, school experiences. And again, they were generally quite positive. The 15 students, they generally enjoyed school, but quite a few felt that the type of learning required was not suited to them. And this was particularly the case where the young person described themselves as more practical than academic. They felt that school didn't really cater for this in any way. Several mentioned the Leaving Cert Applied as a positive experience, while others spoke of not being able to do it because it wasn't offered in their school, even though they would have preferred to. But generally, students felt school had prepared them well for the next step academically, and most students felt they were reasonably well able to self-direct their own learning after school, while some did remark on the lack of preparation for autonomous learning. In terms of their perceptions of their in-school supports, they described the good supports as those that were proactive rather than reactive, those that were student-centered and student-led rather than prescriptive, and in particular those that responded to specific needs instead of just being quite general. And then the bad supports, the supports they felt weren't effective, were those that were overly reliant on a formal diagnosis, which in some cases was not available or very late in coming. There was one student who only got their diagnosis halfway through 6th year, at which point it was very difficult to kind of catch up. the supports that emphasised or even created a difference from peers rather than fostering inclusion, and especially those that could not be accessed without a fight. So the more they had to fight for the support, the more difficult it was, obviously. In terms of then their post-school planning, there was kind of a range of engagement with guidance. So students wanted different things around guidance and advice for post-school planning, and unsurprisingly, with 18-year-olds, quite a few of them didn't know what they wanted. So some barely wanted or needed input from school at all. There was one student who was applying internationally who had organised their own trip out to visit, had done all of the research themselves, and literally just needed the school to sign forms. But that was kind of an outlier on one end. Many students knew what they wanted and how to get there, but they welcomed support with specific dates and steps and maybe locations in the process. Others kind of had a general area they wanted to go into, but appreciated support in translating this into something concrete to do. And then for those who kind of had no idea what to do, they found the guidance of limited use because, you know, the guidance is better at kind of shaping or like encouraging students and telling them exactly what to do than giving them an idea of what they want to do, which they kind of need to decide for themselves. So yeah, very few mentioned a lack of career guidance. Most felt that they were getting career guidance, but some felt that it wasn't quite the guidance that they wanted. And the most common issue raised there, and I mentioned it earlier, was a kind of misalignment with young people's own plans, either through an excessive focus on higher education. Students said, oh God, I wish I'd known that there was further education that might have suited me better, or an apprenticeship, or else students who were now in further education and were like, God, I think I would have preferred to go to university, but it was never presented to me as an option. Very quickly then, in terms of family influence, most interviewees were positive, described their parents as supportive of their decisions, whatever they decided. Very few mentioned feeling under pressure to do specific things. But despite not feeling pressure from parents, many of the young people kind of described following in the parents' general footsteps, either explicitly or implicitly, especially when they weren't sure of what they wanted to do. And yeah, in terms of that kind of piece on socioeconomic disadvantage, generally children of parents with a degree kind of defaulted into higher education. If they weren't sure what they'd do, they'd continue being unsure while they did a degree of some sort, while children of parents without a degree went to further education, apprenticeships, or work instead while they were making up their mind. Finally then, in terms of medium to long-term plans, the young people were generally optimistic about where they would be in 5 years' time. Those in higher education were confident about getting through it and continuing on to postgraduate study or the world of work. Those in further education felt they knew what they had to do to progress into the world of work or continue into higher education. And those in work or not in employment, education or training were generally planning to return to study in the future and were optimistic about it, though not sure maybe of exactly how to do so. So I'll hand you over to Selina now. Thank you.
That's great. Okay, thanks a million, Eamonn. I'm going to take the last 10 minutes to talk about our study then with the special schools. So we started with a census of all 125 special schools back in February to find out the number which were working with young adults of school leaving age. And we found 23 of those schools confirmed they were doing so. So from that 23, we selected a theoretical sample of 8. And the strategy was really designed to ensure a broad mix of schools, particularly in terms of geographic location and nature of disability or need. And within those 8 schools, we conducted interviews with principals, teachers, particularly those with responsibility for transition planning, parents, and some young adults as well, who had just left school. And a lot of that fieldwork was just done in September. So because I only have 10 minutes, I'm just going to give a flavour of some of the themes that are emerging from that work. We're still very much analysing the data. So I'm going to start with the kind of the end of school period for the young adults in these schools, and I'm going to talk about the area of curricular provision and certification, transition preparation, and very briefly on COVID, but I know that's been covered very well already today. And then I'm going to focus on their post-school pathways, the suitability of the options available to them, their initial transition experiences, and a key area in terms of communication between schools and post-school settings and the extent to which there is a joined-up approach. I'm going to identify a couple of key challenges that seem to be emerging at this point at the end. Okay, so in terms of curricular provision then and certification, well, this really varied quite a lot within and across the schools, with many schools reporting a mixed profile of need in their school, and they tailored provision accordingly. So we had a diversity of provision within the schools. A lot of them included JC levels 1 and 2, some level 3, a few of the schools LCA, and a smaller number still offered a couple of Leaving Cert subjects. They all tended to offer some QQI programs, and quite a few offered particular programs devised by the school themselves. To touch briefly on the Junior Cert level 1 and 2, it was prevalent across virtually all of the schools, so I'm going to just touch a little bit on that. There was a lot of positive response in terms of the skills provided by that program, but a prominent concern is the continued absence of national certification. You can read the quote there. They don't really leave with any certifications. Students spend so much time and effort, and the teachers as well, creating hugely differentiated resources, but they're left with no paperwork, basically. So that was a really critical issue and something that schools felt quite strongly about. In terms of the whole area of junior psycho reform and the new programs in place, there was some criticism of that as well. Lots of positives, but a couple of things to flag. The first being that move towards common level papers. A lot of the schools we spoke to felt that really didn't suit their students. Most of our kids would have managed foundation maths, but now it's a common paper. For some subjects like home economics, the common paper does not work. You can't have them all set at one paper, at one level. There should have been a different level in terms of papers given. So there's quite a lot of strong views on that. The other key issue, which isn't new to anybody here, is the lack of follow-on at senior cycle. So nice reforms and lots of reforms at junior cycle, but very little in the way of follow-on at senior cycle. In the absence of a senior cycle program, there is no suitable curricular program for these young people. And in this particular school, they felt the LCA just wouldn't be appropriate for their student group. There was also kind of a sentiment that there was a lack of consideration of the needs and experiences of special schools during the whole senior cycle review process, and quite a few schools were quite strong on that as well. That said, the LCA programme did provoke a little bit of discussion in some of the schools, and there was quite a lot of positive sentiment about the LCA, and positive views particularly in relation to the PDST. The support is super, we will be lost without them. The key value of having that certification, and that certification which really provided real-world skills. It's a fantastic preparation for life after school for the schools offering this programme. But they also identified some key difficulties that they faced in offering the programme. Work experience was a big one in terms of schools providing staff to support that young adult in going out and doing work placements. The resources employers need to support that young adult, and the whole area of insurance was a big one. The shorter school day, because they follow the primary model, was seen to create challenges in fulfilling all the requirements of the LCA programme. In many cases, the schools were seen as not fit for purpose in terms of very outdated buildings and structures and organisation of classrooms. There was a lot of challenge around running multiple programmes within a same classroom, and a lot of the schools were doing that with difficulty. And the key area as well, that special schools don't have enough specialist teachers to offer the LCA programme. So they were really key issues for the schools who were offering the programme and those who felt they couldn't. So in terms of transition preparation, there was really no standard approach across the 8 schools. Each school seemed to have developed their own transition programme, which was often overseen or supported by a teacher who was given responsibility in this area. Now, that said, these programmes tended to have a dual focus. They tended to focus on the whole area of skills development, self-management, independence skills, communication skills, identifying their strengths. And a lot of the work here as well, the focus was also on trying to kind of catch up and to rebuild skills that have been lost in the context of the pandemic, and Billy and Jenny had talked about that earlier. So that tended to be a big focus too. The second key area that schools tended to focus on was supporting decision-making, the young adults and their parents' decision. And that was usually framed in a very collaborative way between the school, the parents and the young adult, and the HSE. And that was generally perceived as quite a positive process, and we'll touch on some of that in a moment. The third thing that a lot of the transition planning seemed to do, and it seemed to underpin a lot of the efforts and a lot of the kind of the programs in place, was kind of managing expectations and raising awareness about what is out there and what isn't out there for young adults with particular types of needs. As one principal said, providing information on what is and what is not out there, more so the latter in many cases. So it was that managing expectations piece was really important as well. But the schools were really quite disappointed with the lack of an overall transition framework from the Department of Education, which could serve to guide schools and also have some more consistency across school contexts. And I'll leave you to read that quote yourself. So there was a little bit of disappointment there that the department haven't really stepped up in that regard. So in terms of the transition process, a key part of that process involves the HSE engaging in a profiling exercise. You're probably all aware they visit the special schools and parents and young adults usually in the October of their final year, and they engage in a profiling exercise. And really the views on that were pretty positive. Overall, many found the process highly informative, responsive, and very supportive of young adults and indeed their parents. So there was very positive sentiment there. There's some quotes there. I'll just read one. "I did find that process quite good because I was listened to. That is what I said I wanted, and it's what we got. He got his extra year at school. He got his transition program. They talked about all his needs. They went through everything. We got all the information we needed, and that was from a parent in one of the schools." So overall, a really kind of positive response on this HSE profiling, which has been in place since 2015, but schools also commented that the process has improved every year since then. That said, there were some concerns about the systems in place and the process. Obviously, the HSE profiling is resource constrained, and that there was a lot of sentiment about the extent to which resources were constraining the potential pathways of young adults they might be able to take, and the kinds of provision they might get in terms of the intensity of the placement, the number of days, and so on. And this is just one quote to highlight that. Often the person will not get the number of hours in the post-school setting that the parent was hoping they may get. They might get a number of days or a number of hours of the week and not full-time. A key issue that emerged across quite a few of the schools was a disconnect. And a disconnect between key players and a disconnect over time. And I think this quote captures it quite well in terms of those disconnections. There still isn't a partnership between schools and the HSE when it comes to the transfer of students. They're running in parallel. They go off and do their profiling, and they link with the service providers as to where they go, but a lot of the time, parents are still waiting in May or June to find out what course their child will be on or what support is going with that child. So there tends to be quite a gap, a lot of activity in October, November, but parents and young adults are waiting till May or June or later to find out what the outcome of that is. So really there was a lot of disappointment around that. This year, it seems some of the schools were asked, and some of the parents were asked to have an up-to-date diagnostic assessment, and that seemed to be a new thing this year and obviously created difficulties where there hadn't been one done for a while. In terms of how parents and the young adults we spoke to, how they reflected on their preparedness and their time in school and their preparedness for that leaving school, really, there were hugely positive sentiments right across the schools in terms of the efforts. The efforts really was the big thing of school leaders and teachers in preparing young adults for leaving school, particularly in terms of their emotional readiness, their independence, and their social and communication skills. And just a couple of quotes there. I'll let you read them. He had an amazing teacher last year, and she was brilliant on working on his strengths and building everything up. His independence was a big thing, trying to get them to be more independent, and they worked on him leaving this cozy little environment. She came on leaps and bounds here. If she could have got another year, she would have stayed. Really, there was a lot of very positive sentiment from the parents and young adults we spoke to. From the young adults themselves, a number came back to the schools to meet with the research team, and they really were incredibly positive about their school days and the opportunity to come back and meet the researchers and tell them about their school experiences. School was my favourite place. I love school. I like to learn everything. And they really did display incredibly strong connections with teaching and non-teaching staff alike. And it was that sense of belonging with school was just so apparent, and it was quite moving. But there were some areas that weren't so strong for these young adults and for their parents. And the first one was the whole area of specialised supports. And I think this quote from a parent captures what a lot of parents and a lot of, indeed, school leaders and teachers were telling us as well. The supports were non-existent. We were lucky that we were comfortable enough financially, and we would have over the years paid OT, speech and language. Non-existent, it really was. It was a joke. And that was tough on parents, and they felt that their son or daughter had missed out as a consequence, and especially those who couldn't afford these kinds of supports. There was also a perception of inequality, and inequality particularly regionally in terms of the access to these specialised supports. They're not standardised across the country. It does depend on what county you're in, and indeed even within a county, it could vary. There was a perception of wide variation in the availability of supports, depending on the type of need and the type of impairment. And again, as has been covered really well earlier, there was a lot of sentiment around the lasting impact of COVID, and I think one parent's quote really captures this very well. The lack of structure during the school lockdowns skyrocketed her anxiety. The whole lockdown drove that to another level, to the point that she's been medicated. The outcomes of not having that structured environment for several months have actually left scars, and we're still dealing with that now, and that wasn't an unusual situation. There was a lot of sentiment as well around the summer programmes and a perceived unfairness around who was able to access those programmes, and some parents were particularly upset over not being able to access summer provision while through their son or daughter's second level years. So in terms of the pathways of these young adults, they went to a range of pathways, many into kind of adult services rather than mainstream settings. And school personnel noted that often this was an easier transition. It was more reassuring, and often the locality, issue came into it, that these services could often be quite close to either the special school or their home. Now, there was a mix of perspective here. So some school personnel and parents spoke positively about the pathways available for their school leavers and the success of that transition, at least during the initial weeks, because they were only in the programme 2-3 weeks when we spoke to them. But others, so there was a bit of a binary, others felt that not all placements were ideal, and funding was seen to impact on the suitability of the pathways on offer. If there was more funding, they could offer a better range of services which might meet needs better. And I guess there was a perception that there's gaps in provision and post-school provision depending on the type of need that a young adult has. So these are just two quotes, I'll just read one. I would think that pupils with a moderate learning disability are catered for, mild to moderate, yes, but the pupils with severe to profound, I don't feel there's an awful lot out there for them. And then a similar quote in relation to those with serious behavioural issues. Particular difficulties were noted for young adults leaving care environments. I won't discuss that now. But that said, I mean, so there's quite a binary in terms of those who feel there's good supports depending on the type of need, and those who don't. But there was quite a few parents then conveyed a broad satisfaction with that initial transition experience. For many, it was just two weeks in the programme. And this, just some quotes, you can read them yourself. The first illustrates kind of the young adult's transition to adulthood and his opportunity to have a student voice, to have his own voice in the process. The second focuses on the development of new connections. And again, the third kind of highlights just the opportunities around more independence and the opportunity to use public transport in this case. And just the process, the learning process and the developing process there. But a couple of areas were more problematic, if you like. And the first of these related to the kind of pre-transition contact, particularly for parents. I would like the parents to also be there on the sampling day, so when the young adult goes to visit the different settings, the parents weren't usually involved. And some felt that would have been a far more better situation, either they at the same time or on a different occasion, that they would have that opportunity. I would like if some of the profiling was done with myself, so that's the teacher, the parent, the young person, and a staff member from the new facility together. Because we were trying to hold an holistic approach, but it is fragmented. So disconnect was a pretty common theme. Lots of talk about the impact of COVID-19 on the transition, on the readiness for transition, and a lot of sentiment around this cohort were really shortchanged. They were robbed of that time at school, and they didn't get any extra time because of it, as one principal commented. So that COVID impacted on their learning and their independence and the skills development, but also on that opportunity to sample and to visit different settings and to kind of make informed decisions. Widespread challenges around transport when the young person leaves the school setting and into a new setting. Typically, transport was not provided, so if they have to get to a centre, the transport facilities is going to be a huge factor, and a lot of the time there isn't enough of a budget to put transport in place. So that really was a very key issue right across all of the schools. And the issue of the cuts in specialised support. So where students were getting specialised supports in school, that typically was cut off when they left school. It was a cliff edge. All of that is gone. Everything is gone. The minute you hit 18, it's meant to be a miracle that everything is meant to be right. And to be honest, it's when they're older you need more, and particularly in the way of medical supports. A lot of parents also spoke of difficulties in accessing social protection and other supports, and really there was a huge lack of information on entitlements and how to access them for the young adults when they leave school. I'm conscious of the time, so I'm just going to cover one or two other points. A key issue, which everybody I'm sure is aware of, is the whole area of staffing difficulties within adult services. So this had widespread implications for the young adults that we spoke to and their families. So the challenges around recruitment and staff turnover has impacted on the readiness of service providers to enrol young adults as planned, or in the intensity of the service provided. And there's just some quotes to illustrate that. That was widespread right across the country in terms of the eight regionally spread schools. So that was a key issue, the staffing difficulties. I'm just going to cover just very briefly just three kind of final challenges that we're seeing to be kind of integral to the kind of the school experiences and the preparedness of young adults when they leave school. The first is the whole area of the changing profile of need within special schools. So as more young people with really high medical needs and more severe and profound disabilities are moving successfully through the educational system and through the school system, in many ways the adult services aren't ready. So there were big questions over whether adult services are ready and prepared for providing that level of support that these young adults need. So there was felt that there's a disjunction there. Lots of concerns over the adequacy of resources in the post-school settings, lots of concerns about the CERC report being totally out of date, and particularly for students with physical disabilities, the whole area of therapy supports that I've talked about. A lot of sentiment around special schools still being designated as primary schools, the consequences for curricular provision, for career guidance, for the length of the school day, and so on. Just one final quote I think is worth leaving with. I'll actually let you read it, I won't read it. But schools put so much effort and so much heart and soul into the education of young adults, particularly with more complex needs. But there's this lingering fear that suddenly they won't have the supports that they need when they leave school, and that their opportunity to contribute to society and live fulfilling lives may not be met. So I think this quote captures it really, really well. So I'll let you read that. So we're halfway through the study, so that's just a flavour of work so far. We've got to do a follow-up survey with the cohort that Eamonn has spoken about. We're going to do in-depth research with kind of under-researched areas, so particularly PLCs, young adults with special education needs and youth reach programmes, and we're going to look at the experiences within adult services as well over the coming months, and then we'll have a final report for spring 2023, and maybe we'll come back next year to give the full results. Okay.